The chair was not marked in any way that Daniel could see, and that was the problem that started everything, because the hall was vast and bright and filled with colors that hurt his eyes, and the seats were arranged in long curves like ripples on water, and he was tired from standing too long while diplomats argued in languages he barely understood. He chose the nearest empty place without thinking, lowering himself carefully into a structure that adjusted to his weight with a soft hum, and he exhaled with relief as the pressure left his legs and spine. Around him, conversation dipped, not enough to silence the room but enough to make the air feel thinner, as if sound itself was holding its breath. Daniel noticed it only after a few seconds, when the ambassador beside him stopped speaking mid-sentence and stared at him with eyes too wide for comfort. Daniel turned slightly, confused, and offered a polite nod, the kind he had practiced during briefings back on the human station. No one nodded back, and a ripple of unease spread outward from his seat like a dropped stone in still water. Far across the hall, beyond columns that rose like carved suns, someone had stopped moving entirely, and Daniel felt a prickle along his neck as if he were being watched. He told himself it was nerves, that first contact always felt heavier than it looked in recordings, and that alien silence did not always mean danger, even when history suggested otherwise. The banquet was meant to celebrate the signing of the ceasefire lattice, a fragile agreement binding 6 species who had spent generations testing each other's defenses. Humans were new to this gathering, admitted less for their power and more for their stubborn refusal to disappear when pressured, a trait that had earned cautious respect. Daniel was not a hero or a general, just a cultural liaison trained to observe and listen and smile at the right moments. He reminded himself of that as he straightened his back and folded his hands the way protocol demanded. The chair beneath him warmed slightly, adjusting again, and a faint pattern of light traced along its edges, responding to his pulse. That was when he realized the seat was not neutral gray like the others, but edged with gold that caught the light differently. At the far end of the hall, the Princess of Karet rose from her throne, and the room fell fully silent in a way that pressed against Daniel's ears. He had seen images of her in briefing files, always static and distant, but none of them captured the weight of her presence now. Her armor was not armor in the human sense, but layered plates of living alloy that shifted subtly with each breath she took. A circlet of gold rested in her pale hair, sharp lines echoing the geometry of her people's ships and cities. Her eyes found Daniel without hesitation, as if the distance between them did not exist at all. Something in her gaze tightened, not with anger, but with focus, the way a blade aligns before a strike. Daniel's mouth went dry, and he wondered dimly if standing would make things better or much worse. No one moved to stop her as she descended the steps from the throne, each footfall measured and soundless against the stone. The deadliest princess, they called her in whispers among the other delegations, a title she neither rejected nor embraced. She had earned it through campaigns that ended wars in weeks that had dragged on for centuries, through choices that spared millions at the cost of thousands. Daniel knew these things because he had studied her history like a test he could not afford to fail. Knowing them did not help now as she crossed the hall, her attention fixed on him with unsettling intensity. He felt every eye turn toward him, felt the invisible lines of fear and expectation converge on the place where he sat. The chair hummed again, and Daniel realized with a jolt that it was responding not just to him, but to her approach. When she stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the fine patterning etched into the alloy at her collar, the silence deepened further. Her presence carried a faint metallic scent, like rain on heated stone, and something sharper beneath it. Daniel stood, belatedly remembering that standing was often safer when confronted by authority, but the chair resisted him gently, holding him in place. A murmur rippled through the hall at that small failure, and Daniel's heart began to pound. The princess tilted her head, studying him from a slight angle, as if evaluating a structure for hidden flaws. Up close, her expression was calm, almost serene, which somehow made the tension worse. She extended one gloved hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture that halted anyone else from intervening. "You are human," she said, and her voice was clear and even, carrying effortlessly through the vast space. It was not a question, but Daniel nodded anyway, because reflex was all he had left. "Yes," he managed, his throat tight, and the sound of his own voice felt small in the hall. She considered this, eyes never leaving his face, and Daniel had the strange sensation of being measured not by his words but by something deeper. That seat is not unmarked, she continued, her tone unchanged. It is reserved. Heat crept up Daniel's neck as understanding finally settled, heavy and undeniable. I'm sorry, he said quickly. I didn't see any indication. I can move. A flicker passed through her eyes at that, something like amusement or perhaps surprise, gone before he could be sure. She did not step aside to let him stand, and the chair did not release its hold. That seat responds to intent, she said. It does not accept those who seek power. A low murmur moved through the gathered delegates, layered with fear and curiosity. Daniel swallowed, realizing that his accidental choice had already marked him in ways he did not understand. I wasn't seeking anything, he said honestly. I was just tired. The princess studied him for a long moment, and in that pause, the fate of more than one world seemed to hang. Finally, she inclined her head slightly, a gesture that rippled through the hall like a shockwave. Then you are precisely what it was made to find, she said. The words settled into the space between them, heavy with implication, and Daniel felt his stomach drop. Around them, the banquet remained frozen, as if time itself was waiting for her next decision. She turned, just enough to address the room without breaking her focus on him. By the laws of Corette, she said, the one who sits there without ambition is offered a choice. A collective intake of breath followed, sharp and fearful, as ancient rules resurfaced in living memory. Daniel's mind raced, fragments of half-remembered briefings colliding with the reality unfolding around him. He knew Corette law prized consent above conquest, choice above coercion, but the costs of those choices were often severe. The princess faced him fully again, her gaze steady and unyielding. You may rise and leave, she said, and nothing further will be asked of you. Relief surged through him, almost dizzying in its intensity. Or, she continued, you may remain, and accept the bond that this seat signifies. The relief curdled into something cold and sharp as the meaning of her words became clear. What kind of bond? Daniel asked, forcing himself to meet her eyes, because looking away felt like surrender. Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but not a threat either. A shared burden, she said, a witness to my choices, and a voice that cannot be silenced. The hall seemed to lean closer, every ear straining to catch his answer. Daniel thought of Earth, of the fragile colonies scattered among stars that did not care if humans survived or not. He thought of how often power went unchecked because no one stood close enough to question it. The chair beneath him warmed again, as if urging him to decide. He took a breath, slow and deliberate, the way he had learned during long nights of mediation training. If I stay, he said carefully, do I get to choose when I speak? The princess considered this, her head tilting just a fraction. Yes, she said, and you will speak when it matters. Something in her certainty steadied him, even as fear churned in his chest. Daniel nodded once, feeling the weight of the moment settle onto his shoulders. I'll stay, he said, and the words echoed farther than he expected. The reaction was immediate and profound, a surge of sound and movement breaking the long-held stillness. The chair released its restraint, reshaping itself to accommodate him anew, its gold edges flaring softly. The princess straightened, satisfaction flickering briefly across her features before fading back into calm resolve. Then the banquet continues, she declared, turning back toward her throne. As she walked away, Daniel realized that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. The deadliest princess had made her choice, and so had he. Somewhere deep within the structure of the seat, a signal awakened, carrying their shared decision into the quiet machinery of the stars. The sound returned to the hall in layers, like waves striking stone from different directions, and Daniel felt it wash over him as he remained seated, hands resting on the reshaped armrests that now fit him too well. Servitors resumed their paths, gliding between tables with trays of shimmering vessels, while delegates whispered in tones sharpened by fear and calculation. Daniel's attention stayed fixed on the princess as she reclaimed her throne, the living alloy of it unfolding to accept her weight. She did not look back, yet he sensed her awareness of him as something physical, like a tether drawn tight across the room. The chair beneath him pulsed softly, each thrum matched to his heartbeat, a reminder that the choice he had made was no longer abstract. He felt exposed, not as a target, but as a variable introduced into a system that had been carefully balanced for centuries. Across the table, an envoy with faceted eyes inclined their head to him with a mixture of respect and unease. Daniel forced himself to breathe evenly, recalling training that suddenly felt inadequate for the reality he was now inhabiting. He lifted a cup offered by a passing servitor, the liquid inside shifting colors as it settled, and took a cautious sip. It tasted faintly sweet, with a mineral edge that lingered, grounding him just enough to think. The princess had said witness, not weapon, and voice, not command, and he clung to those distinctions. Around him, the banquet's rituals unfolded, dancers tracing slow geometric patterns across the floor, while musicians coaxed sound from instruments that glowed with internal light. Yet beneath the pageantry, tension coiled, each species recalculating their position in light of what had just occurred. Daniel realized that his presence was now part of that equation, whether he understood the variables or not. A projection flared briefly above the central dais, resolving into the symbol of the ceasefire lattice, its interlocking lines shimmering. Speeches resumed, formal and precise, each delegate reaffirming commitments with words chosen to offend no one and promise little. Daniel listened, noting how often eyes flicked toward him before returning to the princess, as if measuring her reaction through him. The bond she had mentioned was not visible, yet he felt its pull, a subtle awareness when she shifted or focused her attention. It was not intrusive, more like standing close to someone whose mood you could sense without words. That closeness unsettled him more than overt control would have. He wondered how long it would take before the novelty of his presence hardened into resentment or fear. When the formalities concluded, the hall transitioned into smaller clusters, delegates rising to mingle under the watchful eyes of guards and aides. Daniel hesitated, uncertain whether to move, until the chair released him fully with a gentle hum. He stood, joints stiff, and felt the bond stretch but not resist, a silent allowance. As he took his first steps away from the table, he felt dozens of gazes track him, each assessing risk and opportunity. He reminded himself to walk calmly, to project the same quiet neutrality that had served him in lesser rooms. The princess remained seated, engaged in conversation with an armored figure at her right, but Daniel sensed her awareness shift as he moved. It steadied him, oddly, knowing that she was not ignoring him, even now. He had not gone far when a tall delegate with skin like polished obsidian intercepted him, their voice low and controlled. "You surprise many," the delegate said, their gaze flicking briefly toward the throne before returning. Daniel offered a careful smile, choosing his words as if stepping across thin ice. "I surprised myself," he replied, honesty safer than deflection in this moment. The delegates studied him, then inclined their head. "Survival here often favors the unanticipated," they said, before melting back into the crowd. Daniel exhaled slowly, the encounter reinforcing how quickly perception could shift. A subtle pressure brushed his awareness, not words but intent, guiding him toward a quieter alcove along the hall's perimeter. He followed it instinctively, finding a space where the noise softened and the light dimmed. The princess stood there, alone now, her guards positioned at a respectful distance. Up close again, Daniel felt the same metallic scent, the same sense of contained force. She regarded him without preamble, her gaze searching his face as if checking for cracks. "You are adapting," she said, more observation than praise. "I'm trying," Daniel answered, and meant it. "The bond will deepen," she continued, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "It responds to proximity, to shared context." Daniel nodded, absorbing the information without pressing for more than she offered. "What does it demand?" he asked, careful not to frame it as accusation. She considered him, a pause filled with unspoken histories. "Attention," she said finally, "and honesty, even when it costs." Daniel felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, the same burden he had accepted many times before on smaller stages. She gestured toward the hall, where alliances shifted and reformed with every whispered exchange. "These gatherings decide the fates of worlds," she said, often without those worlds ever knowing how close they came to ruin. Daniel followed her gaze, seeing not spectacle but the fragile machinery beneath it. "If I speak," he asked, "will they listen?" The princess's eyes sharpened slightly. "They will," she said, "because they fear what it means that I chose you." The bluntness of it sent a chill through him. "I didn't choose you because you are human," she added, as if sensing his thoughts. "Nor because you are weak." Daniel met her gaze, steady now. "Then why?" he asked. "Because you sat without hunger," she said, "and because hunger has ended too many futures." The words resonated with him, echoing lessons learned in negotiations where restraint mattered more than leverage. He nodded, understanding more than he could articulate. A signal chimed softly, and the princess straightened, the moment of intimacy closing like a door. "Walk with me," she said, turning back toward the hall. Daniel fell into step beside her, acutely aware of how that simple act would be interpreted. Conversations faltered as they passed, eyes widening, calculations accelerating. Daniel kept his posture open, his expression calm, offering nothing that could be easily weaponized. He felt the bond respond, a quiet affirmation that he was doing as she expected. Together, they moved through the shifting currents of power. As they reached the central dais, the princess paused, addressing a nearby cluster of delegates. "This human speaks with my leave," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard beyond the group. Daniel felt every gaze snap to him, the weight of expectation pressing down. He took a breath, grounding himself in the physical sensations of the moment. "We are here to prevent another war," he said, simply, "not to win the next one." The silence that followed was not empty, but charged, the kind that precedes change. Daniel felt the bond tighten, not in warning, but in alignment. The charged silence fractured into motion as delegates began speaking at once, voices layered with urgency and restraint, and Daniel stood beside the princess feeling the weight of her declaration ripple outward. He sensed the bond sharpen, not tightening but clarifying, as if his awareness had been tuned to a finer resolution. A tall figure with segmented limbs stepped forward, their translator field humming softly as it engaged. "Words are easy," the figure said, "yet wars are born from intentions, not statements." Daniel did not look away, resisting the instinct to defer to the princess, because he understood that this moment belonged to him as much as to her. "Intent is shaped by who is allowed to speak," he replied, keeping his tone even. The princess remained still, her silence a deliberate space he was meant to occupy. Around them, the hall seemed to lean closer, architecture designed to amplify discourse now focusing every curve and surface on the exchange. Daniel felt heat along his spine as the bond carried fragments of the princess's attention, not thoughts, but context and consequence. The segmented delegate tilted their head, considering. "Your species is young," they said, "its history brief and turbulent." Daniel nodded once, acknowledging truth without conceding weakness. "That brevity makes us cautious," he said. "We know how fast mistakes compound." A murmur followed, not agreement but recognition, subtle and dangerous in its potential. The princess shifted then, a small movement that drew every eye, and Daniel felt the bond flex as she aligned with his stance. "Proceed," she said, granting him more than permission, granting him legitimacy. Daniel took a step forward, placing himself slightly ahead of her, a positioning choice that sent fresh ripples through the gathered powers. "We are not here to rewrite your laws or claim your victories," he said, voice steady despite the pressure. "We are here because systems that rely on fear eventually fail." The words landed heavier than he expected, carried by the hall's acoustics and the princess's implicit endorsement. He felt sweat gather at his temples, the cost of visibility exacting its toll. A cluster of delegates began exchanging rapid signals, their internal communications flaring briefly in visible spectra. Daniel caught fragments of reaction, surprise edged with calculation, opportunity brushing against alarm. He pressed on, guided by the same instinct that had led him to sit where he should not have. "Fear simplifies," he said. "It narrows choices until only conflict remains." He paused, letting the silence work in his favor. "When fear is removed," he continued, "complexity returns, and with it, alternatives." The princess's presence at his back was a constant, grounding pressure. A new voice entered the exchange, softer but no less authoritative, emanating from a being whose form seemed perpetually in flux. Alternatives demand trust, the voice said, and trust is rare among us. Daniel turned toward the speaker, meeting the shifting outline without flinching. Trust starts small, he said, often with a single witness. The implication hung there, undeniable, and Daniel felt the bond resonate, as if acknowledging the truth of his words. The shifting being stilled slightly, their forms settling into clearer definition. Witnesses can be silenced, they countered. Daniel shook his head, slowly. Only if they stand alone, he said. The princess stepped forward then, coming to stand beside him, her presence amplifying the statement without repeating it. By my law, she said, this witness stands under my protection. A collective reaction swept the hall, some delegates recoiling, others leaning forward with renewed interest. Daniel felt a surge of emotion through the bond, not triumph, but resolve tempered by caution. The princess was committing herself publicly, narrowing her own options. He understood now that his role was not to shield her from consequence, but to share it. The exchange fractured into multiple threads as delegates began testing the new dynamic, posing questions that circled rather than struck. Daniel answered where he could, deferring when necessary, always mindful of the invisible line he walked. The bond fed him subtle cues, moments when silence served better than speech, when a glance toward the princess carried more weight than words. Hours seemed to pass in compressed bursts, time bending under the intensity of negotiation. Daniel's throat grew raw, his limbs heavy, but he did not falter. Each response built upon the last, a lattice of intent forming alongside the ceasefire's fragile structure. He realized that this, too, was war, waged with patience instead of weapons. When the hall finally began to empty, exhaustion settled over Daniel like a physical weight. Delegates withdrew in measured groups, conversations trailing off into private channels. The princess remained beside him until the last cluster dispersed, her attention never fully leaving the space around them. Only then did she turn to him, her expression unreadable. You held, she said simply. Daniel exhaled, tension draining from his shoulders. I didn't know if I would, he admitted. You did, she replied, and that matters. She gestured toward a side passage, and Daniel followed, the bond guiding him as surely as her presence. The corridor beyond the hall was cooler, the air carrying a faint hum of distant machinery. Here, away from the audience, the weight of performance lifted slightly, replaced by something quieter and more dangerous. You altered trajectories today, she said, not as praise but as fact. Some will resent you for it. Daniel managed a tired smile. I'm used to that, he said. She regarded him for a long moment, then nodded. The bond will not protect you from all consequences, she said, only from unjust ones. Daniel accepted that without argument, understanding that no such safeguard could exist. What happens next? He asked. The princess turned toward a viewport overlooking the stars, their cold light spilling into the corridor. Now, she said, we see who adapts. Daniel joined her at the viewport, the vastness beyond both humbling and clarifying. He felt the bond settle into a steadier rhythm, less acute but more enduring. For the first time since the banquet began, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had chosen. He was no longer merely observing history, but entangled within it. The princess's reflection met his in the glass, two figures from different worlds aligned by circumstance and choice. Daniel wondered what shape that alignment would take in the days to come. The stars offered no answers, only the promise of consequence. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm Daniel had not known existed, measured not by clocks but by moments of tension and release, and he moved through them beside the princess as if the universe had quietly rewritten his path. They met in chambers carved from dark crystal and living stone, places where light bent softly and every surface carried echoes of old decisions. The bond between them no longer flared with novelty, instead settling into a constant presence that sharpened Daniel's awareness without overwhelming it. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her posture, the minute changes in the air when she weighed a choice before speaking. In turn, she learned the cadence of his silence, the difference between hesitation and refusal, between caution and fear. Their proximity unsettled many, and Daniel felt that unease like static brushing his skin whenever others entered the room. Yet no one challenged the arrangement directly, not while the ceasefire lattice remained fragile and incomplete. Opposition formed quietly, as Daniel had expected, gathering not in open defiance but in calculated delays and procedural fractures. Committees demanded revisions, sub-clauses multiplied, and ancient grievances resurfaced under the guise of legal precision. Daniel watched it unfold with growing concern, recognizing the pattern from human history all too well. The princess did not rush to counter these maneuvers, choosing instead to let them expose themselves. Her patience was formidable, but Daniel sensed the strain beneath it, the cost of restraint mounting with each passing hour. The bond carried that strain to him, not as burden but as shared context, urging him to act. He waited for the right opening, knowing that timing mattered more than volume. The opening came during a closed council session, convened under the pretense of technical clarification. Daniel sat beside the princess at the circular table, its surface alive with shifting projections and layered data. Across from them, representatives of three major powers pressed for amendments that would effectively neuter enforcement mechanisms. Their arguments were elegant, their voices smooth, and their intentions unmistakable. Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the warning sign that inaction would be mistaken for acquiescence. He glanced at the princess, meeting her eyes for a fraction of a second. The bond aligned, a silent consent flowing between them. "May I?" Daniel said, his voice cutting cleanly through the overlapping discussion. The room stilled, attention snapping toward him with varying degrees of irritation. He stood slowly, placing his hands on the table's edge, grounding himself in the cool surface. "You speak of stability," he continued, "but what you are proposing creates delay, not peace." One delegate bristled, their translator flaring. "Human impatience is not our concern," they said sharply. Daniel did not flinch, his gaze steady. "This is not impatience," he replied. "It is recognition." He gestured toward the projection, isolating a timeline that mapped prior treaties across centuries. "Every agreement that failed did so because enforcement was optional," he said. The data responded to his touch, lines converging to highlight collapse points with stark clarity. "You call it flexibility," he went on, "but history calls it permission." The room grew quiet, the weight of evidence pressing down on the rhetoric that had preceded it. Daniel felt the bond pulse, not urging him forward but anchoring him in resolve. The princess rose then, her movement deliberate, her presence shifting the balance of the room instantly. "The human speaks with my authority," she said, her voice calm and unyielding. Her gaze swept the council, daring any to challenge the claim. "No enforcement means no ceasefire," she continued, "and no ceasefire means I resume my campaigns." The threat was not theatrical, simply factual, and it landed with devastating effect. Several delegates recoiled visibly, calculations recalibrating at speed. Daniel felt a ripple of cold certainty through the bond, the princess committing herself to a path with no easy retreat. The resistance did not vanish, but it fractured, opportunism giving way to survival instinct. Compromises emerged, narrower and more honest, shaped by the reality of consequence. Daniel remained standing until the session concluded, his legs aching, his mind razor-sharp. When the final clauses locked into place, a low chime signaled provisional acceptance. The sound carried relief and dread in equal measure, the hallmark of real progress. As the delegates filed out, many avoided Daniel's gaze, while others regarded him with new, wary respect. He exhaled slowly, tension releasing in a wave that left him briefly unsteady. Later, alone with the princess in a quiet observation chamber, the aftermath settled between them. The stars beyond the viewport drifted in slow silence, indifferent to the fragile peace being forged below. "You escalated," she said, not accusing, simply noting. "I had to," Daniel replied, meeting her gaze without apology. If they kept carving away at the agreement, there would be nothing left worth defending. She studied him for a long moment, then inclined her head. "You chose correctly," she said, and the approval carried weight far beyond praise. The bond shifted subtly after that, deepening into something more mutual, less hierarchical. Daniel felt it in the way she listened now, in how her questions invited rather than tested. Yet with that shift came danger, and he was keenly aware of it. Aligning too closely with her made him a target not just for political maneuvering but for more direct threats. He voiced this concern, and she did not dismiss it. "Risk is inherent," she said, "but isolation is deadlier." Daniel nodded, accepting the calculus. The first attempt came sooner than he expected, abrupt and almost clumsy in its execution. An unauthorized signal breached the station's internal network, targeting the chamber where Daniel was reviewing data. Alarms flared softly, containment fields snapping into place. Daniel felt the bond surge, sharp and immediate, carrying the princess's awareness to him in a flash of urgency. He moved as trained, following emergency protocols with calm efficiency. Security forces converged, neutralizing the threat before it could manifest physically. The message was clear enough without success. When the princess arrived moments later, her composure was intact, but Daniel felt the edge beneath it. "You are now a lever," she said quietly, as guards secured the area. "I know," Daniel replied, heart still racing. "Then you understand why the next step cannot be cautious," she continued. Daniel met her gaze, already sensing what was coming. "If we hesitate now," she said, "they will keep testing the edges." He nodded, the weight of impending escalation settling over him. The plan she outlined was risky by any measure, a public consolidation of authority that would expose them both. It involved convening an interspecies assembly larger than any before, forcing commitments into the open. Daniel listened carefully, asking questions where clarity mattered most. "This will provoke backlash," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "but it will also end ambiguity." He considered the choice, feeling the bond steady him as it always did when stakes were highest. "Then let's do it," he said, and meant it fully. As preparations began, Daniel felt the momentum shift, events accelerating toward an inevitable confrontation. The princess moved with decisive purpose, issuing commands that rippled across fleets and worlds. Daniel worked alongside her, drafting frameworks and safeguards, ensuring voices would be heard rather than drowned out. Together, they shaped a moment that would force the galaxy to choose between fear and accountability. The quiet before the assembly felt heavy, charged with anticipation and threat. Daniel stood at the viewport one last time before the day arrived, watching stars slide past. He knew that whatever followed, there would be no returning to the life he had known. The assembly convened under a sky of cold brilliance, a constructed firmament projected above the vast forum where thousands of representatives gathered, and Daniel felt the scale of it press against his senses as he stood beside the princess. The space was larger than the banquet hall by orders of magnitude, designed to hold not comfort but consequence, every surface optimized to transmit voice and reaction without distortion. Daniel's footsteps echoed softly as he took his place, the sound grounding him amid the enormity. The bond between him and the princess was steady now, a deep current rather than a flare, carrying shared awareness without overwhelming either of them. He felt her focus sharpen as the final delegates arrived, sensed the tension coiling across the room like a held breath. This was no ceremony of celebration, but a reckoning shaped by intent and exposure. Daniel understood that once words were spoken here, they would ripple outward beyond recall. The princess stepped forward first, her presence commanding silence with an ease that still unsettled Daniel. She spoke of the ceasefire lattice not as a triumph, but as a necessity born of accumulated failure. Her words were precise, stripped of flourish, each sentence placed like a stone in a foundation. Daniel listened, tracking the reactions flickering across alien faces and shifting forms. Some hardened, others softened, many recalculated in real time. When she finished, she did not claim victory or authority, but gestured to Daniel, yielding the floor without hesitation. The transfer of attention was immediate and total. Daniel felt the weight settle fully then, heavier than at any moment before, yet clearer. He spoke not of law or threat, but of pattern, of cycles he had seen repeated across human history and now mirrored here. He described how fear narrowed choices until violence seemed inevitable, how unchecked power isolated itself until collapse followed. The forum listened, not because his voice was loud, but because it was steady. He told them what enforcement meant, not as punishment, but as shared accountability. Each word drew on the bond, not as amplification, but as alignment, grounding his intent. The silence that followed his final sentence was vast and charged. Questions followed, sharp and probing, designed to fracture resolve and expose weakness. Daniel answered where he could, deferred where honesty demanded it, and when uncertainty arose, he acknowledged it without retreat. The princess remained beside him, her presence a constant signal that these words carried consequence. Opposition surfaced openly now, stripped of polite delay, challenging the framework and its risks. Daniel welcomed it, engaging directly, refusing to let fear masquerade as pragmatism. He felt exhaustion creeping in, his body reminding him of its limits, but the bond steadied him, sharing the load. Hours stretched, then folded inward, time losing meaning under the intensity. The turning point came not from argument, but from an unexpected alignment. A coalition long considered neutral stepped forward, publicly endorsing the framework with measured conditions. Their support shifted the balance, forcing others to choose between isolation and participation. Daniel felt the moment as a physical shift, like pressure releasing from a sealed chamber. The princess inclined her head slightly, acknowledgement passing through the bond like a quiet current. Commitments followed, some reluctant, some eager, but all recorded and bound. When the final assent was given, a low harmonic tone resonated through the forum, signaling consensus. Relief did not come immediately. Instead, a heavy stillness settled, the kind that follows irreversible change. Daniel remained standing, aware that the cost of what they had achieved would not be evenly distributed. He sensed the princess's attention turn inward, calculating the aftermath with ruthless clarity. As the assembly adjourned, delegates departed in controlled waves, carrying decisions back to their worlds. Daniel watched them go, understanding that peace, if it held, would be fragile and contested. Yet it would exist, and that mattered. In the quieter days that followed, the station seemed almost subdued. Daniel moved through its corridors with a new awareness, security patterns subtly adjusted around him. The princess continued her duties, now bound publicly to a structure that constrained even her formidable authority. They spoke often, not always of politics, sometimes of histories and losses carried quietly. The bond had evolved into something less defined, more mutual, no longer anchored solely in law. Daniel felt its presence most when she was absent, a steady reminder of shared responsibility. He realized that the choice he had made at the banquet had reshaped not just events, but himself. The backlash came, as expected, but not all at once. Some worlds tested enforcement, probing for weakness, only to find response swift and unified. Others sought to undermine from within, their efforts blunted by transparency. Daniel found himself traveling, serving as witness and mediator where tensions flared. Each journey carried risk, each decision layered with consequence. Yet he was not alone, the bond extending across distance, a quiet assurance that alignment held. The princess remained a constant presence in his awareness, even when light years separated them. Over time, fear loosened its grip, replaced by cautious habit. Systems adapted, not without friction, but with increasing coherence. Daniel saw signs of something fragile and rare taking shape, a structure built not on dominance but participation. He knew it could fail, that vigilance would be required long after his own role ended. The princess knew it too, and they spoke of succession and legacy with unflinching honesty. Neither romanticized their work, yet neither retreated from it. What they had forged demanded endurance, not celebration. On the anniversary of the assembly, Daniel returned to the forum alone. The space was quiet now, the projected sky dimmed to a neutral glow. He stood where he had spoken, feeling the echo of that moment without being consumed by it. The bond stirred softly, and he knew the princess was aware of where he stood. He felt gratitude then, not for power or recognition, but for the chance to have mattered. The seat at the banquet had been a threshold, not a reward. Crossing it had changed the course of more than one life. When he left the forum, Daniel did not look back. The future was no longer something observed from the margins, but something shaped through presence and choice. He carried that understanding with him, into corridors and councils yet to come. The galaxy remained vast and uncertain, but it was no longer silent in the face of fear. Daniel walked forward, a human witness among the stars, bound not by ambition but by intent. The deadliest princess had made her choice, and through it, countless others had found theirs. The consequences would unfold for generations, but for now, the lattice held.